Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I'm glad I was in the chamber to witness this passage of these bills pertaining to the scourge of Alzheimer's by unanimous consent. This is a rare bright spot in our activities where we actually all come together and agree on good policy. We've also taken the step to pass another piece of bipartisan legislation today, something that used to be standard operating procedure in this chamber. We would call up bipartisan legislation that would address everything from the opioid crisis to medical innovation. Members would debate the bills, we'd offer amendments, and in the end, hold an up or down vote. But sadly, this has become too rare a phenomenon. In recent years, the Senate, controlled by our friends on the Democratic side, have strayed from our core legislative duties. Instead of voting on bipartisan bills, marking them up in committee where everybody can participate, this chamber devotes instead the vast majority of its time to things from relatively unimportant nominations to partisan show votes. As a result, major tasks like funding the government, strengthening our defense, are left to the last possible moment and then rushed across the finish line. But I'm glad for today that the Senate has gotten back to basics and passed a strong bipartisan package to help keep our kids safe online. Every day, our children see content online about suicide, eating disorders, and drug use, and other topics that are not suitable for children. At the same time, online bullying and harassment run rampant, and the statistics on teen suicide and mental health paint an alarming picture for the next generation. The bill that passed today includes two important pieces of legislation to help address that crisis. The Kids Online Safety Act, introduced by Senators Blumenthal and Blackburn, provides children and parents with the tools and safeguards they need to keep harmful content out of children's social media feeds. More than 2/3 of the Senate sponsored these bills, and including this one, and I'm proud to be one of them. We also passed another bill that I was proud to co-sponsor called the Children and Teens Online Privacy Protection Act, introduced by Senators Markey and Cassidy. That bill prohibits internet companies from collecting personal information from their youngest users and establishes better safeguards to protect children's privacy. It protects and prevents big tech from tracking and targeting kids with the most addictive content possible. Congress has been working on legislation in this area for many years, and I want to commend Senators Blackburn and Cassidy for getting us to this point. There are a number of other bills that have passed the Judiciary Committee on a bipartisan basis, as the presiding officer knows, and I hope we'll be able to turn to those soon. But these bills we passed today struck the right balance between the First Amendment and safety, which is no easy task, which is perhaps one reason why it's taken us so long to get here. But I appreciate these senators' leadership, and I'm proud the Senate has finally taken an important step to help keep America's children safe online. Mr. President, on another matter, I want to speak briefly about President Biden's proposal to essentially unconstitutionally transform the Supreme Court into another political branch of government. Every student of government, every high school civics class teaches that ours is a government of three co-equal branches, the two political branches being the Senate and the House, the legislative branch, and then the executive branch. The reason they're political is because they're accountable to the public through regular elections. Conversely, the judiciary is unique in that it is unaccountable to the voters. Judges are nominated by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. But as long as they are conducting themselves appropriately, they can serve as long as they live, literally have life tenure. Rarely, very rarely, there's the remedy of impeachment for extraordinary cases, but as I said, that happens almost not at all. But in recent years, our Democratic colleagues have floated a litany of institutional changes to try to tilt the balance of power in the judiciary in their favor. They're not content to allow the courts to do their job, which is to call balls and strikes. Again, judges are supposed to interpret the law and the facts and apply that to a given case and not decide ahead of time who should win and who should lose. Judges don't take public opinion polls and decide what's popular because they take the same oath we do to uphold the Constitution and laws of the United States, but they do so in a framework of judicial independence. Former Justice Scalia used to say the independent judiciary is the gold standard, is the secret sauce for the United States form of government, because there has to be some neutral arbiter to basically decide contested cases, and that is our independent judiciary. But our Democratic colleagues, since they have been upset about some of the decisions of the court, have gone so far as to suggest that the court be restructured. This was tried back in the administration of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in the famous court packing cases. He wanted to add additional justices to the Supreme Court because he thought that would change the receptivity of the case to causes that he supported. But we've also seen changes advocated here in this Senate, institutional changes by our Democratic colleagues who are unhappy with the fact that they don't win 100% of the vote. They've advocated eliminating the filibuster to clear the path for radical and unpopular policy ideas. They've attempted to federalize or nationalize our voting laws and take over America's elections as opposed to having those decided at the state level. They push for statehood for the District of Columbia as well as Puerto Rico. And presumably each of those would get 2 United States senators and a member of Congress, and thus tilt the balance of power here in the Senate. But when it comes to the Supreme Court, it's clear that the left is outraged over some of the court's recent decisions. As a matter of fact, not that long ago, the majority leader stood on the front steps of the Supreme Court and called out 2 sitting justices by name and essentially threatened them if they decided these cases in a way that he disagreed with. That was an extraordinary act of bad judgment by the majority leader. He actually went so far as to say, Justice Gorsuch, Justice Kavanaugh, you won't know what hit you. Again, shocking to, I think, most of us who regard the court as an independent and separate branch of government immune from politics. But of course, many Democrats are upset that the court's decision in Roe versus Wade has now returned the issue of abortion to the states, where on a state-by-state basis, legislators and voters will decide what the appropriate limits are on abortion, which divides much of our country. They're upset about the decision on presidential immunity. They want the president to be subject to ordinary litigation on a regular basis using what has now come to be known as lawfare to achieve political objectives. And they're concerned that the court has done away with something as arcane and relatively poorly understood as Chevron deference, basically saying if an agency decides something, there's not much the courts or that Congress can do about it. Our colleagues don't want to keep losing cases in the courtroom, so they've adopted a new strategy. If you can't win the game, change the rules. And their playbook has gone something like this. Number one, villainize the Supreme Court. I mentioned the comments of the Majority Leader, which are not unique. The strategy is to make the justices seem evil or biased or out of touch when they rule against progressive causes in the courtroom. The second step in the playbook is to offer a solution or a proposed solution to address the problems that Democrats have manufactured. That involves an act which itself is unconstitutional and irresponsible, which is the overhaul of the court packing I mentioned a moment ago. And three, it's to go on the attack and stay on the attack and vilify anyone who dares oppose these changes as somehow corrupt and anti-democratic. From packing the court with liberal justices to dictating recusal requirements for the justices to holding security funding hostage if the Supreme Court doesn't do what our Democratic colleagues want them to do. Our colleagues have offered many plans to fully assert control over this independent branch of government, the judiciary. For a long time, these proposals were only supported by a fringe of the Democratic Party, but now they've become more commonplace and infiltrated the Oval Office itself. President Joe Biden used the pages of the Washington Post to advocate for exactly the sorts of dramatic and unconstitutional changes that I just mentioned. He wants to somehow establish term limits for justices. He wants to craft a schedule for new appointments, force a code of ethics on the justices written by Congress, and destroy the long-standing precedent of presidential immunity. These proposals are not to enhance the fairness of the court or promote equality or justice or any other good government objective. They're about power, about control. They would turn our most independent branch of government into a partisan branch to ensure that our Democratic colleagues are the ones who ultimately wield the power. It's not bad enough that President Biden has promoted these radical changes, but even more concerning that his protege, Vice President Harris, has fully embraced them. She made it clear that if she's elected in November, the assault on the independent judiciary and the Supreme Court will not go away. It will accelerate. A potential Harris administration would stage a full-blown coup to overtake the Supreme Court and eviscerate judicial independence. She basically would disregard the Constitution itself and attempt to turn the court into an institution that serves at the pleasure of a political party, hers. We need to call it what it is, Mr. President. The Biden-Harris proposal is not about protecting democracy or ensuring accountability. It's about consolidating power and undermining institutions that stand in the way of their agenda. If these radical ideas were to become a reality, they would dangerously shift the balance of power and erode the independence of the Supreme Court. Again, the crown jewels of our form of government. They would ultimately politicize the one branch of government that was designed to be insulated from partisanship. Our founders deliberately designed a federal government with three distinct but equal branches. They established a set of checks and balances to prevent any one branch from forcing another to bend to its will. But unfortunately, that's exactly what President Biden and his party are trying to do today, to blur the lines between executive, legislative, and judicial branches to secure partisan political wins and accrue more power. But here in the United States Senate, an institution created for this purpose, cooler heads must prevail. We cannot stoop to the level of the mob. We have to stand up for an independent judiciary and the Supreme Court as an essential institution in our form of government, regardless of how we feel about the decisions. Many decisions by the Supreme Court I have disagreed with in the past, and I'm sure I will in the future. But as one justice said, the Supreme Court is not final because it's right. It's right because it's final. That's the only way to preserve the integrity of the judiciary, and our invaluable checks and balances is with an independent judiciary, one that isn't politicized and doesn't bend to the will of a political party. Republicans will continue to fight to protect the integrity of America's judicial system, and we will not allow this president or any political party to hijack the federal judiciary for their own partisan benefit. President, I yield the floor.